Dramatization, inspired by patterns of housing discrimination. You won't believe what happened when a landlord tried to evict an elderly couple. The marble in the lobby gleamed like a promise. It was the kind of marble that belonged to glass towers and law firms, not to the steady, lived-in life upstairs in 3B, where the curtains were always drawn at dusk and the smell of coffee seemed to settle into the upholstery like an old blessing. Vincent Hartley stood in that lobby with the kind of posture money earns, the shoulders back, jaw set, cufflinks catching the light. He was a man who measured success in vacancy rates and press quotes. He had spent the morning shaking hands and reminding himself that changing a building's roster was a profitability exercise dressed in euphemism. For him, tenants were units of revenue or obstacles to be removed. Benjamin Davis was not a problem. He had lived in 3B for 23 years. He had delivered the mail for 31. He kept his Sunday suit pressed like an offering, the Bible on his nightstand as reliably as sunrise. Dorothy Davis folded her hymnal into the crook of her arm and had taught Sunday school at the little brick church 2 blocks over for longer than most of the congregation had been alive. Their apartment smelled of lemon oil and church coffee, lined with photographs, smiling faces, a daughter's graduation, a little boy with 2 front teeth missing. That boy, small as a fist in the black and white photo, was their adopted son Isaiah, whose child portrait still hung above the mantel. His current life, books, robes, and a nameplate with a federal bench number felt to them like a quiet miracle. For the Davises, home was not a commodity. It was a ledger of small mercies. On that morning in the marble lobby, Vincent Hartley decided to make a quick calculation. He would clean house, tidy up the roster, set the building on a new course. He had been briefed by consultants who called the move value optimization. He had been told, in the language investors used, that certain profiles of tenancy made it harder to attract higher rents. He would be decisive. He would set an example. Benjamin shuffled through the lobby door in his Sunday suit, a brown hat tucked under his arm. He smiled at the doorman the way he always had. He'd walked the city in all kinds of weather, fog, sleet, heat that stuck to your collar, and the city had taught him the small joys of being seen. He was used to nods and brief conversations about the weather, church suppers, and who had roses in their window boxes. That morning, he did not expect the sudden coldness of a stranger's contempt. "You folks need to move," Vincent said. He stepped close, and his voice had the clipped edge of someone used to commanding things into being. He wanted the reaction, the startled confusion, perhaps a flurry of questions he could extinguish with paperwork. Benjamin blinked. Dorothy, who had been feeding the meter, turned and smiled politely. Vincent lowered himself to a pitch that made the air between them stale. He spat a phrase at them like a stone. The words landed in the marble air. "I don't rent to." And he finished it with something that had no place in decent conversation. The building seemed to inhale around them. A stranger in the lobby looked away, a coffee clutched at her chest. The doorman's tie tightened involuntarily. The sound of Vincent's contempt felt like a slap. Benjamin's mouth pressed into a thin line. He could have answered. In his younger years, he would have answered. Dorothy's hand found the Bible under her arm. They moved as if their Sunday rituals had been translated into muscle memory. They did not raise their voices. For them, dignity had always been sharper than retort. Later, a security camera would show Vincent turning on his heel, the echo of his footsteps swallowed by marble. That moment, brief, ugly, laced with power, would be the first stone tossed into the pond. Ripples would follow. Back in 3B, the apartment held a softness that felt like resistance. Light fell across the doorway, and dust motes moved like small rehearsed angels. The couch sagged exactly where Benjamin had read his paper for years. The kitchen tiles had a hairline crack by the sink, and a set of mismatched mugs on a rack, each with a story. The one from their honeymoon, the chipped yellow one Dorothy used on rainy mornings. Photographs were arranged not for decoration, but for memory. There was the laminated adoption certificate Benjamin kept in a drawer, not because it was required, but because it was a day worth remembering every week. Isaiah's first Christmas stocking was still tucked behind the mantel. Benjamin stood by the window and watched the street, not for business, but for faces. People carried groceries past the building. A grocer's boy waved to a neighbor. When Dorothy sang, the apartment became worship. When Benjamin hummed in the kitchen, the whole building seemed to settle. They were quiet pillars for others. Mrs. Patterson from 2C, who trusted Dorothy with a batch of casseroles every Thanksgiving. Mr. Coleman, who traded crossword tips with Benjamin. Renters who learned, slowly, that there were people in the building whose presence meant a kind of moral ballast. News of the encounter in the lobby traveled through the walls and stairwells like a rumor. But for the Davises, it was the start of something more material. A week after Vincent's words, a typed envelope arrived under the door. A notice to vacate, stamped and formal and shockingly clinical. Non-renewal of tenancy, it said in bureaucratic language that somehow removed the human. A line in the notice referenced alleged repeated disturbances and code violations, a phrase as cold as the marble Hartley loved. They had paid their rent, on time, for 23 years. The ledger in their filing cabinet bore that out. For decades, Benjamin's paycheck had been steady. Dorothy tended to the church's nursery and taught children to read the Psalms. The building superintendent had known Benjamin by name and by shoe size. To see a typed accusation was to see a lie dressed in authority. When they walked down to the property office, the air in Hartley Properties smelled like coffee and new contracts. Vincent greeted them with that same practiced smile. He slid a folder across his desk the way one slides a business card. Within those folders there were inspection reports, grainy photos of a water stain, a complaint form filled out by a tenant in a building 2 floors away, a note alleging excessive visitors. The documents were precise, numbered, and arranged to form a narrative. Vincent's eyes were trained to expect resistance. He did not anticipate the quiet, methodical way Benjamin and Dorothy chose to respond. "We have lived here 23 years, Dorothy said, her voice steady. She pressed a hand to the laminated adoption certificate in her bag, like holding a talisman. "We have always paid. We have always cared for this place." Vincent's lips thinned. "Policies change," he said, as if human lives were clauses to be amended. "Management is restructuring. We have to ensure the building meets new standards." Benjamin, who had delivered letter after letter to that very office when he was on duty at the Postal Service, understood forms. He took a pen and asked for copies. He asked for names. He asked for dates. Vincent offered a glossy card and vague promises. The superintendent, called in to mediate, spoke of paperwork and procedures, a kind of litany designed to drown insistence. The first week saw the paperwork multiply. Notices arrived that spoke in legalese and in a tone intended to sound impartial. Notice of violation. Inspection required. Immediate repairs. The meat of the matter was in small acts. A maintenance team at odd hours would knock and measure and photograph. A plunger would be left in the hall with no note. An inspector snapped pictures of a faint water ring on the kitchen ceiling. An old stain, benign, yellowed around the edge, but suddenly reclassified as structural neglect. There were anonymous noise complaints recorded for times when the Davises were at church. Neighbors began to notice. Mrs. Patterson dropped by with a casserole and left it undecided on the counter. "Are you sure," she asked, "that there's nothing you can do?" Her worry felt like a presence. Mr. Coleman, who worked odd jobs for the building, complained quietly to Benjamin that he had been asked to fill out a complaint form by someone from the property office. They said it was for insurance, he explained, but his eyes said he had been nudged. Benjamin began to document. He kept a binder with receipts, letters, the rent ledger, meticulous things his years at the post office had trained him to maintain. Late one night, tapping numbers into spreadsheets to justify a restructuring report, Donna sat with the fluorescent glow and found herself rereading the files. She had sat in meetings where margins were tightened and human narratives simplified into bullet points. She had been told to be discreet. But noticing was different from participating. The first time she flagged an inconsistency, she was rebuffed. The second time she was smiled at and told, "We handle this." The third time she left a note in a folder, "Recheck vendor logs," and found it gone. That small erasure produced a memory of her mother's voice. "Child, do what's right even when no one's looking." The voice had a clarity to it. It was a moral compass she had stored away. Harassment took physical forms. There were inspections at odd hours that required Benjamin to move scripture and photographs for the first time in years. A handyman opened the closet where Dorothy kept hymnals and hummed a tune off-key. The water stain was photographed from 2 angles, with the flash exaggerated to make the ring look recent. Photographs were printed, annotated in red pen, and resubmitted as evidence of neglect. A plumber's invoice arrived in the mail for work never performed. Someone placed an anonymous complaint under their door alleging loitering and suspicious activity at night. An accusation that was met with incredulous laughter at first, and then quiet fear. Dorothy tried to keep the rhythm of the household. She folded laundry with hands that trembled slightly and kept the kettle on for visitors. She made lists in a neat script, and she wrote down names of people to call in the event of escalation. Mrs. Patterson, Mr. Coleman, Isaiah. But the strain found cracks. At night she would wake in a sweat, image fragments of a morning empty of routine, a hymn unsung. Once, after a particularly invasive inspection, she sat at the kitchen table and began to cry with the slow, steady weight of grief. Benjamin came to her side and put a hand on her back. He did not speak much. He had always believed that silence could sometimes hold more dignity than argument. But that silence was a new thing now, a silence that shook. Neighbors began to gather small artifacts of witness. A scrap of paper with a maintenance worker's name left in a stairwell. A time-stamped video from a resident's phone showing a car with Hartley Properties signage idling at odd hours. Mrs. Patterson wrote down what she had seen at the office. A man in a suit pointing at a map of the building and circling units. Mr. Coleman's neighbor recounted a phone call from someone describing habitual visitors in 3B. These pieces were small, but they formed a mosaic when placed side by side. They were the raw material of resistance, receipts, videos, times, and signatures that could show pattern instead of coincidence. A phrase began to stick in the stairwell whispers: manufactured violations. It had the feel of a mechanic's diagnosis, where something looked wrong because it had been made to look wrong. Over the course of the next 2 weeks, the dossier on 3B grew. Vinyl files bulged in the Davises' living room, and Benjamin sat each night with a highlighter, noting the dates of notices, the names of inspectors, and the times of water shutoffs. "If someone calls us, we'll answer," he told Dorothy one night, voice low like a prayer. "We'll keep it all, every letter, every visit. We'll show the pattern." Dorothy nodded and drew a breath like she used to in church before she sang. Her eyes softened when she spoke of Isaiah. "He used to count the steps in the house," she remembered aloud. 7, because he said 7 was a good number. He counted blessings, too. Their memory of adopting Isaiah at 7 colored everything. To them, homes were sanctified by such small rituals, counting steps, tucking photographs under the mantel, whispering a long list of gratitude before sleep. The community's response shifted from soft concern to small acts of support. Mrs. Patterson baked extra pies and put them on the steps of 3B. Mr. Coleman posted a short video on a neighborhood forum showing Hartley Properties sign with the comments, "Been seeing some odd activity here." A local pastor made a quiet call and offered to host a meeting. The landlord seemed to be making a tactical error. By focusing his efforts on a couple that the neighborhood loved, he had accidentally lit a small, stubborn fire. But Hartley did not care for neighborhood gossip. He cared for numbers. The next phase of his plan intensified. Formal notices were escalated into a notice to vacate with firm dates, and a list of alleged code violations was handed to a contractor to verify. A contractor who, when asked for a certificate, provided a flimsy card without a registration number. Hartley's language hardened in memos. We must address legacy tenancy effectively. He believed the law and human lives were separate domains, and that paperwork could be used to reclassify life into something tidy and transferable. During this period, Donna could no longer reconcile what she had assumed her job was with what she saw the office doing. Her instinct had been to remain a cog. But when she overheard a phone call where a maintenance manager joked about making things look bad on purpose, something in her broke open. She began to copy files to a secure folder, not yet sure why she felt compelled to keep them, but knowing, with a clarity that startled her, that someone would need proof. She made a list in the margins of her notebook: dates, times, names. She wrote the vendor's call time and scribbled down license plate numbers. It was a small, furtive thing at first, like hiding jewelry in a thrifted coat. But each note steadied her. She had childhood memories of her mother defending a neighbor who had been evicted without cause. Donna had sat at that kitchen table then, and her mother had said simply, "Don't let them make lies into law." That memory returned like a command. The pattern of harassment achieved a cruel efficiency. Utility payments were delayed in ways that made it appear that the tenants had neglected them. A meter that usually drew a particular reading suddenly had another. Letters arrived that required immediate action, and when the Davises acted, calling maintenance, documenting, the responses were slow, sometimes non-compliant. Once, after a water shutoff that left them with cold dishes and a shivering apartment, Benjamin went down to the office and demanded an explanation. He was met by a clerk who sighed and told him that someone had authorized the shutoff for structural inspection. This was when Dorothy's resilience cracked. She had always been the spirit that sang them through, but she had never been called garbage in a lobby. Never had the word of a man with cufflinks threatened the place they had built. One afternoon, after a maintenance crew left a door propped open and a note claiming they had found mold, Dorothy sat at the kitchen table and folded and refolded a dish towel until her hands ached. She pressed a palm to the laminated adoption certificate and let out a sound that was half prayer and half confession. For the first time since the late nights picking Isaiah from the foster care center, she allowed herself to imagine a life without the place she had set a table for neighbors. Neighbors filled out witness notes. A video surfaced of Vincent in the lobby, cheeks flushed, nervously muttering about plans to rehab to a prospective investor. In it, he smiled too widely when he said, "We're just optimizing." In a separate clip, an employee could be heard suggesting the creation of evidence to support eviction claims. These items, small and disjointed, started to gather into something that could be called pattern. When Benjamin opened his binder that night, the pages seemed to lean toward one another with purpose. He called Isaiah. "I've got it all," he said. "They've started the paperwork. They think they're going to push us out. I don't know what they're going to do next." Isaiah listened more than he spoke. His life had taught him to be measured at the outset, before striking. "Send me everything you have," he said quietly. "Every notice, every picture. Don't throw anything away. Take the neighbors' videos. I'm going to look into this." Benjamin read out a list while Dorothy made coffee, and the apartment filled with the scent of lemon oil and a melody that rose and fell. There was still faith here, stubborn and patient, but there was also a new ferocity, one shaped by the responsibility of a son who had become a man of the law and a couple who had taught him the courage to stay. This is where others would have folded, people with less history in a place, less witness in a community, less proof to gather. But the Davises had a lifetime of receipts, a ledger of being seen, and a neighborhood that refused to let them be invisible. For every notice the office issued, there was a neighbor who had seen a maintenance van come at noon, not midnight. For every photo that claimed a hazard, there was a signature on a dated rent slip proving a pattern of payment and presence. When Donna set aside the copy of a file that documented an unauthorized water cut, she felt that strange mix of danger and righteousness. She took small, careful steps, encrypting a folder, copying it to a drive she kept in her purse, and writing a note to herself. If anything goes sideways, make sure this gets out. Then she placed the drive in her sock drawer, away from the office cameras and the quick hands of managers who might, with a signature, make a life disappear. The building began to feel less like an address and more like a front. Vincent made calls to investors. He sent out a glossy mailer touting upgrades and new amenities. He hosted open houses that pulled the sun away from the windows and made the unit numbers look like entries in a catalog. The calculus in his head did not include the moral weight of a couple's memories. He saw instead a floor plan with potential. In the evenings at the kitchen table, Benjamin and Dorothy rehearsed contingencies the way parishioners might rehearse a hymn. They would call Isaiah. They would gather testimony. They would document, as Benjamin kept saying, because patterns could not be argued away when pinned to paper. Dorothy, sometimes, would sing a verse under her breath, "It is well with my soul." The line comforted and affirmed in the same small breath. Across town, Isaiah started making calls. He was not yet in full robes. He moved instead with the judicial habit of removing emotion from sentences until there was only strategy. He asked to see things, photographs, timestamps, videos. He scanned the invoices and noted the oddities. A vendor with no license number, a maintenance request logged at a time when those who were supposed to be working had punch-in records elsewhere. He made a note about the notice to vacate, the way it had been issued with a thinness that suggested an agenda, all the legal language of policy with none of the lived context. Isaiah also called his clerk and asked quietly for a list of resources, places to file a complaint, agencies that handled discrimination. He knew the difference between law as an abstract and law as a tool wielded by the vulnerable. He wanted to use the latter to shield the people who had sheltered him. When the community realized that the notices were not isolated, a quiet insistence became audible. People began filling out forms, writing dates in calendars, making little inventories. The Davises' apartment became a hub for memory, an archive of small truths, receipts, and neighbor testimonies. It was, for a time, the center of a moral map. Then came the evening. The lights flickered. The water pressure fell and then went entirely. It was not an accident, they suspected, because the timing was precise, and the notice that followed cited a safety inspection with a name no one recognized. Neighbors banged pots on their doors. Someone called the city. Benjamin called the maintenance number repeatedly and was routed through automated menus that led nowhere. The building's management office did not answer its door. That night, as Dorothy held a candle and sang a hymn that seemed to stitch the darkness into something bearable, Benjamin sat up with the binder and read aloud each notice's date. He underlined the ones that had signatures that did not match the printed roster on the vendor's website. He counted anomalies, like a man tallying coins. Each anomaly was a bead on a string that, pulled tight, formed a pattern. Donna sat at home that night and opened the encrypted drive. She paged through copies of emails she had sent in corporate tones, then watched as they were replied to with memos about efficiency. She felt the weight of years of compliance dropping like a stone in her gut. The drive in her hand felt impossibly heavy and impossibly light, the heft of truth in the small casing of plastic. They were far from resolved. Documents could be shredded, videos could be deleted, notices could be rewritten. But the Davises had begun to do what everyone in a story like theirs had to do if they were to be more than victims. They began to collect witnesses. If this moves you, Please check the pinned resources in the description to learn basic steps for documenting housing discrimination and where to report it. Knowing where to turn matters. The campaign against 3B continued with a meticulousness that made it feel less like conflict and more like a project. Vincent pushed harder, and he pushed publicly. Open houses with professional photographers who did not include the old hymn book in their frames. Investor meetings where he used the word turnaround, as if one could turn a life inside out and call it progress. Every public step he took invited private scrutiny. On an overcast Tuesday, Dorothy arrived home to find a notice taped to her door that listed a mandatory inspection time and asked her to be present. Below the time, handwritten, someone had scrawled, "Failure to appear will result in further action." She sat on the stoop and read it twice, then once again. A man passed by and nodded to her. He had that look of someone who'd seen more than his share of small cruelties. "You hang in there," he said. It was the smallest possible thing, an acknowledgement that meant everything. Benjamin responded by calling every number he could find. He called the superintendent, the management office, the vendor listed on the notice. When he pressed for identification on the inspector, he was told to trust the process. He did trust the process because he had believed in certain institutions all his life, even those that had not always been just. Now he was asking them to be so. The file grew. A receipt for a repair that showed no repairman's signature. A photograph with an unrelated unit in the background. A notarized statement from a neighbor who swore she had never filed a complaint but had been asked to sign one. Each increment in the file felt like a small reclaiming of truth. But nights were not spent in files alone. Dorothy woke at 3 in the morning one week and sat in the kitchen, hands clasped, and began to pray in a voice so low it was almost a soundless litany. She prayed for dignity, for sense, for the safety of the little life scripts she had built with Benjamin. She prayed for the boy in the photo, to whom she and Benjamin had given a home all those years ago. In the soft glow of the clock, her voice steadied like a thread. When Benjamin finally put the phone down after another call, this time to a tenant rights hotline, he folded his hands. He had prepared for a fight not as a man who wanted to, but as a man who would not be moved. He had learned to order his feelings into lists and dates. Yet there was, beneath the lists, a tenderness that refused to be bureaucratized. Then came the day a group of municipal inspectors arrived, legitimate men and women who moved with badges and clipboards and the authority of city work. They walked through 3B with the procedural calm of their vocation, and they found nothing that matched the severity of the claims. The water stain was old and superficial. Wiring was intact. A neighbor's video corroborated the Davises' timeline. It was, despite Vincent's dossier, nothing more than an aging apartment worn by time and care. The inspector's report, when it came across the Davises' hands, read like a vindication. It was not an exoneration of everything that had happened, because it could not undo the humiliation or the threat, but it was a small official correction of a narrative that had been spinning into being. Vincent did not like being corrected. He called an emergency meeting with his management team and demanded answers that were sharp and final. But even as he scolded, the evidence Donna had started to collect sat unexamined in a small drive in her sock drawer. She had been pacing, pulling at the nerves of her conscience. She had not yet done anything public with it. The drive, for the moment, was a promise to herself. Dorothy's breakdown had been a quiet thing that reverberated. She had sat in a pew at the little church and let the choir's music wash over her until she could breathe again. People came by with casseroles and prayers. Community meetings were brief and focused. People shared what they observed. They wrote down times and voices and license plate numbers. A small group organized a neighborhood watch of witnesses, not to patrol, but to record, to be a living archive that could say, with truth, "We saw." The story was reaching a tipping point, but it had not yet broken. Papers could still pile. Notices could still find their way under doors. Vincent could still pursue the tidy elimination he preferred. The Davises had gathered the tools of resistance: documentation, community, dignity, a son who had learned how to marshal legal mechanisms without losing sight of the human stakes. Donna had the files. Isaiah had the inclination and the time to gather more than a son might. Neighbors had video and signatures. But clustered around these facts was a tenderness that was perhaps the sharpest weapon of all: Benjamin and Dorothy's history in the building, a living memory that made the idea of eviction not just a change of address, but an uprooting of a life of service. On a rain-slick morning, Benjamin took the binder to the small community room under the building and set it down among the sandwiches Mrs. Patterson had brought and the coffee Isaiah had ordered to keep the conversation warm. He opened the binder and started to speak in his quiet voice. He told the room about a life spent carrying letters, about Easter suppers, about the boy who had become a judge. He read aloud a receipt. He read aloud a notice. Each thing he read was a small reclaiming. The room listened. The more they heard, the clearer the pattern became: a strategy to manufacture problems rather than solve them. It was clever, hidebound in bureaucracy, but it depended on the assumption that paperwork could replace truth. The neighbors refused that assumption. When the meeting broke up, Isaiah hugged his parents and then asked to keep the binder. "I'll get copies," he said. "I'll also look into reporting channels. HUD has a process for discrimination claims. Let me collect everything so we can see if a pattern rises beyond this building." Dorothy nodded, equal parts grateful and exhausted. She took a deep breath and, like someone accustomed to prayer, prepared for a sustained effort. They had begun to push back, but nobody had yet walked into Hartley Properties with the momentum that would make the building's next steps inevitable. Donna sat at home that night and, hands slightly trembling, opened her computer and began to send an anonymous tip to a journalist she admired. The draft email was short and careful: facts, dates, oddities. She paused, then added a line about a drive in her sock drawer, and then deleted it. For now, she would keep her evidence close. She would watch what the others did. As the weeks tightened into the sort of pressure that reshapes ordinary lives, the Davises kept doing the ordinary things: Sunday morning hymns, counting steps as Isaiah had taught, keeping photographs safe from inspection. These were the rituals that sustained them.
They were more than aesthetic. They were proof that a life persisted despite attempts to reclassify it. The pressure, paper-thin and persistent, moved toward a new phase. Management's emails grew curt. Notices were sent with firmer deadlines. But so did the neighbors' resolve. The stairwell hummed not with gossip anymore, but with a collective inventory of facts. The small acts of resistance were steady, each one a pebble that, when thrown, might trip the man in the marble lobby. Dorothy sang softly one evening, and Benjamin, for the first time in weeks, laughed, low and unexpected. "We are still here," he said, joy threaded through the sentence like a hymn. They believed they could be pushed, but not erased. They believed that memory mattered, that a life witnessed was harder to remove than a name on a lease. It was in that fragile place, neither safe nor lost, that Benjamin picked up the phone for a call he had been readying and dialing for many nights. He would call Isaiah and tell him everything. He would ask for help, not because he expected a miracle, but because he wanted a witness amplified by power and law and, perhaps more importantly, by a son's love. He would ask for the kind of help that would call the pattern into plain view. He dialed. The line rang and rang. The next part of their story, what would happen when those disks of evidence and witness collided with institutional muscle, had not yet unfolded. For now, there were only the documents, the quiet acts of neighborly record-keeping, Donna's drive unopened, and a family braced for whatever would come next. The line clicked, steady and small, the way an anchor drops into water and waits. Isaiah held the phone, listening to the rhythm of his father's breath on the other end, The little scrape of a chair, Dorothy humming without words in the background. He had been away from this kind of raw fear for a long time. Courtrooms had taught him to translate it into documents and motions. Tonight, instead, he translated it into a promise. "Send it," he said, voice measured. "Every letter, every photo, and don't move anything. Leave them exactly how they are." He hung up with a quiet firmness that felt like a benediction. Then he started to move. Calls to a trusted clerk, to a contact at the U.S. Attorney's Office, and one careful, deliberate call to a HUD investigator he had met at a conference the prior year. He did not make promises he could not keep. He built a pathway. He asked the clerk to catalog everything they received and to prepare a secure chain of custody box. He asked the girl in his chambers to print the binder's pages into a single indexed packet. His training whispered the right words: pattern, intent, disparate treatment, while memory furnished the motives. He wanted the paperwork to bear witness in a way that no single indignity ever could. Isaiah arrived at 3B the next morning in a plain coat, not the black robe people associated with his bench.
He walked the hallway as a son again, nodding at neighbors who peeked from behind curtains, carrying a box with gloves and an evidence label. Benjamin opened the door as if it were the very same thing he had opened 1,000 times, and when he saw his son, he seemed to breathe slightly straighter, as if the room had been cleared of an ugly fog. Isaiah moved through the apartment with the calm professionalism that always returned to him when a cause was righteous. He didn't bark orders. He asked for copies, for dates, for names. Dorothy pressed a paper towel into his hand, a receipt from 2 years before, and he lifted it like a relic. He asked to photograph the ledger, the adoption certificate, the hymn book tucked behind a stack of bills. He cataloged the neighbor videos, the maintenance notes, the time-stamped emails. It was work that felt almost sacramental, to name what had been done and to put a voice to it. When Isaiah stepped across to the community room and set the binder down on the folding table, the neighbors closed in like a net. They had brought with them sticky notes, phone screenshots, and a nervous, resolute courage. Isaiah looked at them and said simply, "We will not let this be swept away." It was not pious language. It was a civic imperative. He told them, without legal minutia, what steps he would take: how to file an administrative complaint with HUD, how to create a preservation of evidence, and, critically, how to get copies into federal hands. He asked Mrs. Patterson for the name of the woman who had recorded the van. He asked Mr. Coleman for his schedule the day maintenance had supposedly been at 3B. Everyone in the room felt suddenly part of a larger grammar of truth. The first formal action was administrative, a complaint filed with HUD alleging discrimination and retaliatory eviction. That complaint, Isaiah knew, would start a procedural investigation, but he also knew the limits of paperwork without witness and corroboration. He met with a HUD investigator in a narrow office near the courthouse, and over 3 hours the inspector reviewed invoices, timestamps, and a pattern of communications that could no longer be dismissed as mere clerical error. When Isaiah handed over Donna's encrypted thumb drive, its existence now no longer a secret but a calculated risk, the investigator's face stiffened. Inside were emails that spoke in the cut and dried voice of property management, but threaded through them were franker messages. A request to manufacture evidence, a vendor who had been paid without producing a work order, timestamps that contradict sign-in sheets. "That's the kind of thing we take very seriously," the investigator said. "If this is corroborated, it escalates beyond an administrative remedy." Isaiah nodded and, without theatricality, called a colleague at the U.S. Attorney's Office. He carefully described a pattern of civil rights violations, conduct aimed at a protected class through deliberate removal of tenancy, and suggested they look at the evidence for possible civil rights charges. There is a lean, machine-like quality to federal intervention. It begins with evidence, then moves to probable cause, and if the facts align, to the authority of a warrant. Isaiah had learned how to assemble that machine without ever making the legal arguments the public expects. He built a folder of human truth into a form the system could act upon. Meanwhile, Donna sat at her kitchen table with the drive on the table as if it were a small, bright animal she had rescued. She had called in sick twice that week, claimed a stomach flu, but what she felt was more like a labor of conscience that made her bones ache. She had left work late the previous night and copied email chains into a secure cloud she had paid for from her own account. She wrote a note to herself, 3 lines, stating that if anything happened to her, the drive should be delivered to a specific journalist. She could have done that then and there and saved herself months of quiet terror. Instead, she waited, not trusting the suddenness of drastic moves. She wanted, somehow, to be sure the neighbors and Isaiah were part of the act. When federal agents arrived at Hartley Properties, they did it with the low, precise manner of a team that had become professional in the face of cruelty. They did not storm the office with dramatic flourish. They served documents with polite, steady voices and then asked to see records. Vincent's office, once a shrine of leather and strategically placed glass, felt suddenly ordinary. Agents asked for computers, for ledgers, for vendor logs. They photographed folders and sealed drawers. Vincent turned pale and then red with a tide of anger that no longer had anywhere to land. "You can't just," he tried to say, but the sentence stopped in his mouth. The agents were not men to be argued into inattention. One of them spoke to him about civil investigations, gently, as if the words could still land sensibly in a business mind. "We have probable cause to believe there was a pattern of discriminatory practices," the agent said. "We will need your cooperation." Outside the office, a small crowd had gathered, the neighborhood's first conscious spectators of this uneven power play. Someone had called a reporter, and now a camera lens focused on the stoic face of Benjamin as he stood with Dorothy at the curb. The narrative closed quickly. Here were the people who had endured, the ones who had shown their files to a son, and there across the street was a man in a suit who once spat words in a marble lobby. The presence of cameras made everything crisp, like frost in morning light. It made witnesses more likely to speak up. Agents found evidence in the Hartley ledger, payments to shell vendors for work never performed, memos instructing staff to document appearances, and lists of units that management wanted freed for turnover. They also found the emails Donna had noted in private, an internal culture that treated tenants as variables, not people. With enough corroboration, the case no longer looked like bureaucratic overreach. It looked like a pattern engineered to remove certain residents and to reshape a building's demographic profile for profit. That afternoon, Vincent Hartley was escorted from his office in handcuffs. It was an image with a cinematic sting. The man who once used marble lobbies as a stage now walked with the thinness of a human being who had been stripped of his usual instruments. Reporters pressed microphones, neighbors pressed close. Someone filmed Benjamin and Dorothy as they watched the man pass, and when cameras focused on them, Benjamin lowered his eyes politely and then looked up, with a quiet that felt like a verdict in itself. "That's him," Mrs. Patterson said, clapping her hand to her mouth. The small circle of neighbors who had become a civic archive cheered, not in triumph but in relief. Across town, Isaiah allowed himself a sharp inhale, the way a swimmer does before diving. He had not wanted criminal charges for their own sake. He had wanted truth to be acknowledged. The arrest, for him, meant that the system could be used to protect the small things people cherished. It would not be the end. Isaiah knew this. Federal investigations stretch and bend. They require depositions, witness testimony, and sometimes long negotiations. Hartley would have lawyers who were used to turning civil suits into storms. But the arrest shifted the story's axis. The man whose contempt had been caught on camera was now in the hands of authorities who could transform pattern into prosecution. Public reaction unfolded as it does when a narrative aligns with a larger social unease. Local news ran segments showing the lobby video and interviews with neighbors. A social media post by a young man who had grown up in the building went viral for a day. A short, bright clip with the caption, "23 years, one paper." People wrote to the Davises, strangers sending prayers, recipes, and offers to testify. The courthouse steps filled with cameras one rainy morning when the U.S. Attorney made a public statement about the importance of enforcing civil rights protections in housing. He spoke with the measured cadence of a public official and used the words pattern, intentional discrimination, and retaliation. He also took a moment to mention the Fair Housing Act, the legal framework that prohibits housing discrimination, and to thank residents who had documented and cooperated. According to the National Fair Housing Alliance, thousands of complaints of housing discrimination are reported each year, a reminder that the Davises' experience was part of a broader landscape. The statistic was not a headline meant to flatten the story. It was a framing device, a way to say that what happened in one building is often replicated elsewhere, sometimes invisibly. Inside a federal pretrial room, Donna sat across from a prosecutor with her thumb drive on the table between them. She looked smaller than she had 2 months earlier in the offices where she had stapled invoices. She was pale but steady. The prosecutor explained immunity considerations, offered the possibility that her cooperation could shape plea agreements or civil findings, and asked if she would be willing to testify. She had rehearsed this in the kitchen at night, like someone rehearses a prayer, over and over until her voice unspooled into truth. "I did what they asked," she told the courtroom later, voice not loud but clear. "I put together folders and signed things. I believed the company line. But then I started to see things that weren't true. People were being made to look bad to justify removal." Her testimony threaded through emails and timestamps, and her presence made the case feel human in a way documents could not. She described one meeting where a manager joked that data can be made to look like anything, and she named names gently, but without the demeaning tone that an accusatory spectacle sometimes brings. When she finished, she walked back to her seat and lowered her head. For weeks she received calls, some full of anger, some of gratitude, from people she had never met. She was frightened, but she had taken a step that unmoored a system. The case moved forward on 2 tracks, a federal civil rights investigation and a looming civil suit from the Davises and other tenants who had been targeted. In a courtroom that smelled faintly of dust and coffee, Isaiah sat with a team of pro bono attorneys he had arranged, watching as legal arguments unfolded. The judge who presided, a man known for his steady hand, had the look of someone who had heard many similar stories. The testimony was less a spectacle and more a careful unspooling of intent and consequence. Witnesses described meetings, memos, and the deliberate tactics used to manufacture violations. Neighbors testified, not as crusaders, but as citizens, offering what they had seen. Vans arriving at odd hours, a contractor who never produced a license, a maintenance request with no follow-up. The courtroom's cadence was not cinematic in the way television makes it seem. It was slow, deliberate, punctuated by objections and clarifications. But it acquired its own drama in the accumulation of small facts. That accumulation, pages upon pages of payroll records, vendor invoices, phone logs, was the work of patient people who refused to let their truths be erased. Months later, under the pressure of federal scrutiny and the weight of public attention, Hartley Properties reached a settlement in a civil suit filed by the tenants and a related consent decree with federal authorities. In press statements put out by the parties and covered by local news, the company agreed to significant monetary compensation for harmed tenants, to fund relocation assistance where needed, and to adopt a court-supervised compliance program to ensure non-discriminatory practices going forward. Reported figures circulated, numbers journalists used to encapsulate the case's gravity, and some outlets mentioned a settlement figure of $2.3 million. That number appeared in several accounts as an outcome of the litigation and was widely circulated in the media as a dramatized detail of the restitution. Beyond the money, the legal outcomes included institutional changes. Hartley Properties was subject to oversight, its management practices audited, and a requirement to offer training to staff on the Fair Housing Act and non-discriminatory policy. The U.S. Attorney's Office issued a statement that the enforcement action was intended not only to punish misconduct, but to prevent its repetition. In tandem, HUD implemented remedial steps and provided resources to tenant advocacy groups in the area. For the Davises and their neighbors, these measures were not merely symbolic. They were structural protections that might, at least, make the ledger of life harder to rewrite. The neighborhood received another kind of recompense. A local nonprofit affordable housing organization, buoyed by the case's publicity and determined to restore the building's fortunes in a more humane way, negotiated to purchase the property. The nonprofit's model was not profit-driven, but stewardship-driven. Tenants would have a voice on the board, repairs would be transparent, and a tenant advisory council would monitor practices. The building's sign changed over a slow week. Hartley Properties' brass logo removed, replaced by a modest plaque that read simply, "Community Housing Cooperative." The plaque itself was not a cure-all, but it signaled an intentional reorientation. Donna's life shifted too. After months of giving testimony and navigating the hostility that sometimes accompanies whistleblowing, she received a call from the nonprofit's director. They had been impressed, she was told, not only by Donna's willingness to come forward, but by the attention she paid to process and to rights. They offered her a role, initially part-time, as a compliance coordinator, whose job would be to train property staff on tenant rights and to create transparent records for maintenance and inspections. It was, for Donna, a chance for redemption that was not theatrical but practical. She accepted, tentatively, and for the first time in a long while, she felt that the spreadsheet could become a shield rather than a sword. The day Donna walked back into 3B, this time as a representative of a nonprofit rather than as a cog in a firm intent on displacement, the air in the apartment felt different. Dorothy opened the door and, rather than recoiling, embraced Donna with the kind of warmth that defanged whatever remained of corporate ire. It was a complicated moment. Donna had not been a hero in anyone's simple narrations. She had been at once complicit and repentant. Dorothy, who had spent decades forgiving in small ways, took her hands and said, "We are glad you're here." It was not a blanket absolution of everything that had happened, but an act of human repair that carried its own authority. Community restoration unfolded slowly, in rituals rather than proclamations. The nonprofit scheduled a tenant meeting where a woman who had once written a complaint on a napkin now sat on the advisory council and explained, in her soft voice, how inspection records would now be digitized and publicly viewable. The superintendent, who treated residents with suspicion, was encouraged to attend training. Maintenance requests were posted on a visible board with dates and the names of people assigned. These were administrative steps, but they changed the tenor of the building. People began to feel, plausibly, that the place where they had laid their heads would not be arbitrarily reclassified. There were also meals. The first Thanksgiving after the settlement, the community room hosted a dinner where neighbors sat elbow to elbow and traded stories that had once been private. Benjamin carved a roasted chicken with a care that felt ceremonial. Dorothy made a sweet potato casserole with the same hands that had once folded hymnals. Isaiah arrived and sat at the head of the table, not as a judge, but as a son who had come home. The crowd cheered for simple things, pies that Mrs. Patterson had baked, casseroles that smelled like belonging. And in those tastes, the neighborhood tasted victory more intimate and less legal than any press release. Years passed with the slow turn of seasons. The nonprofit stabilized the building, replaced faulty wiring with careful inspections, and engaged tenants in budgeting decisions. Hartley, who had lost the sheen of his lobby and then, eventually, his business holdings in the city, faded from headlines. His name became, in neighborhood lore, an example of someone who deployed power for profit and misread how a community might respond. Benjamin aged as people do, creeping gray in the hair, slower steps up the stairs, but with a dignity that never lost its core. He still pressed his Sunday suit, though it had softened at the elbows, and he still kept the Bible at the bedside. Dorothy grew quieter in the way the world makes elders quieter, but her voice still carried a hymn like a talisman on days that felt uncertain. Isaiah visited often, sometimes with robes folded over his arm after sitting a bench hearing, sometimes with empty hands and a lunch bag, always with the ease of a son. They marked anniversaries in ways that would mean to a family more than to a legal record. On the 5th anniversary of the arrest, neighborhood kids chalked a mural on the sidewalk in bright colors, a painted row of houses with words under them, "Here we remember." At a small ceremony, the nonprofit unveiled a plaque inside the lobby recognizing residents who stood for justice. Benjamin and Dorothy were asked to say a few words. Benjamin coughed once and then spoke slowly. "We did what most people do," he said. "We didn't let truth be forgotten. We kept our receipts. We kept our faith. We kept each other." The line between gratitude and grief in his voice made the crowd hush in a way that was almost sacred. Time, of course, had its own claims. Benjamin's steps grew slower until one winter he had a cough that wouldn't leave. Family gathered in the apartment under the same light that had once shown dust motes as if they were angels. Isaiah sat by the bed and read from a ledger of family memories, receipts of kindness, notes of birthdays, pages of a life that had been marked by ordinary mercy. Dorothy sang an old hymn in a voice so soft the words were spectral. When Benjamin's breath eased for the last time, it felt not like a forensic moment, but like a familiar thing drawing to a gentle close, a letter folded and placed in a drawer. The funeral was small and held in the little brick church where Dorothy had taught Sunday school. Mourners spoke of Benjamin's mail routes and of the way he had changed the world one stamp at a time. People brought casseroles, photographs, and a quiet sense that the Davises had, in their long endurance, taught something vital. That dignity, documented and witnessed, is hard to erase. Dorothy stayed in 3B after Benjamin's death. She moved with the slow cadence of ritual, keeping the lamp on at dusk in case a neighbor needed light. Isaiah called often and sat with her on quiet afternoons, holding her hand while they watched sunlight make a pattern on the rug. Friends and neighbors came by with pies and small comforts. A group of children, who had grown up in the building and had been toddlers when the notices arrived, now circled Dorothy at a holiday dinner like satellites, their voices joyful and unaware of the long wait their elders had borne. Donna visited sometimes too. She had become, in a way she had not expected, the public face of a kind of reform. She spent her days training staff, mediating complaints, and ensuring that paperwork did not become a weapon. Dorothy and Donna developed an uneasy, then steady friendship. They traded recipes, shared laughs over the peculiarity of bureaucracy, and sat in the sun on the stoop eating slices of melon in July. Donna had children now, and would sometimes push a stroller by the building and point to the window where a woman with a rolled hymnal once taught. "That's Mrs. Davis," she'd tell her 2-year-old, who would wave solemnly at a woman he had never met before. Years after Benjamin's death, the neighborhood still spoke of the day a landlord tried to evict an elderly couple and found instead that he had woken a community. The story had become a local parable, a caution about predation and a testament to the power of ordinary observation. City groups used the building as a case study in tenant organizing and in trainings about the Fair Housing Act. Isaiah occasionally gave talks where he emphasized the moral duties that lie behind statutes, to secure a home not only in law but in practice. The plaque in the lobby, small, brass, a bit worn by hands that liked to touch it, was read aloud to visiting students. People in the neighborhood still said the phrase Benjamin had leaned on so often: "Keep everything, show the pattern." It became, in council sessions and ministry groups, a simple instruction with a deep root. In the end, what surprised people was not merely the arrest or the settlement, but the quiet thing that followed: restoration. Homes were mended, lives were not undone. Donna trained new property managers in a modest classroom near the building. The nonprofit put on an annual tenant rights fair in the courtyard, with printed pamphlets, hot coffee, and a table where older residents could come and ask questions about how to keep records. Isaiah, who had once been a frightened boy rescued into a family's care, stood sometimes at that table as a volunteer, not with a gavel, but with a handout and a patient smile. Dorothy, older now, and with hair silver as prayer, often sat near the mantel and watched the young children sprint by in summer, banging on a drum someone had donated. She would sometimes take out a small envelope that had once contained Benjamin's handwriting and read it like scripture. A list of small favors he had done, the names of people he remembered to buy paper towels for, the date of the first time Isaiah recited the Lord's Prayer at their kitchen table. She kept the hymn book in a place of honor and occasionally sang a verse aloud, a reminder that the inner goods of life had endured. On a late autumn afternoon, Dorothy opened her door to find a group of neighbors standing with a small cake and a violin. They had come to celebrate what they called another year of being here. They sang, they told stories, and they left a card that had been signed by dozens of tenants, names written in different hands, smudged and earnest. Dorothy placed that card next to Benjamin's ledger in the drawer and sat back feeling the continuity of a life that had been sustained by community.
If there is a single image that seems to carry the weight of the whole story, it is simple. An elderly woman in a modest apartment, the light of late day sliding across a groove in the wooden floor, a hymn book open on her lap, neighbors at her door like an ark of living testimony. What began as a cruelty in a marble lobby, words spat like acid, became a lesson in how dignity resists erasure, how testimony can be accumulated like coins in a tin for a rainy day, and how institutions, when pressed with evidence and conscience, can be compelled to correct their course. I want to close with a direct note to you who watched this unfold. If this story touches you, remember 3 small acts that can make a big difference. Document. Keep receipts, photos, and dates. Witness. If you see a pattern, write it down and be willing to speak. Report. There are federal and local channels, including HUD, that exist to take complaints seriously. This is not legal advice, only a plea based on what helped a family in this dramatized account. Share this story with someone who needs to know they are not alone. Consider supporting local fair housing organizations that train tenants and provide legal assistance. Link in description. Justice is often built from patient documentation, from neighbors who refuse to let a lie stand as truth, and from the courage of people who, like Benjamin and Dorothy, hold to the dignity of home. They would have liked that. Not headlines, but the ongoing work of neighbors keeping watch. Not triumphalism, but the quiet dignity of plates set for guests and hymn books opened in the twilight. That is what remained after a landlord tried to evict an elderly couple and found instead that a community was watching, and that watching became the tool of justice.